Hey everyone, and welcome to another edition of Seriously Risky Business, the podcast we do here at Risky Business, which focuses on big picture stuff, government policy, regulation, and just, the mega trends in cybersecurity. And of course, this podcast is based off the work of my colleague, Tom Uren, who joins me now. G'day, Tom.
G'day, Patrick. How are you?
Good. And this edition of Seriously Risky Business is brought to you by Thinkst. So Thinkst Canary is a terrific product. It's like a honeypot that you could put on your network that alerts when people touch it when they shouldn't, and people love it, right? So it's definitely wins on the customer satisfaction thing. Also quite affordable and heartily endorsed by all of us here at Risky Biz HQ. So Tom, we've just finished the edit of your newsletter for the week, and we're going to walk through that now. And you've covered a few things. I actually want to start with your second item. And I previewed this in yesterday's show with Adam Boileau. But the NCSC in the United Kingdom, has published some guidance on what is and what is not a comedy bug. What is a forgivable vulnerability? What is not a forgivable vulnerability? And I think this is, terrific work, because it's about time someone defined what is and what is not forgivable, because you've got a CVSS score for bugs, which tells you how serious they are, but you don't have a shame score. And that's really what this is trying to quantify. So walk us through this, if you will.
Yeah, so the idea is that what it's really trying to get at is what are the bugs that shouldn't be there in the first place? And the paper references a 2007 description by this bloke called Steve Christie of MITRE, the sort of think tank. And it says that if a bug's unforgivable, it means basically that the vendor totally disregarded secure development practices. They just shouldn't exist. No excuses. So that's what they're trying to quantify. And I guess the idea of quantifying it is that means that you can sort of step back and, it's not me saying that you're terrible. It's this methodology.
Framework. It's this framework. It's this matrix. It's, it's not just vibes. Yeah.
Yeah. So it gets away from the government saying you people are all terrible. It's saying our methodology finds that the bugs in your software are unforgivable. And so basically they look at, what are the common causes of bugs? Like how do they occur and what are the mitigations? And then they try and score how easy it is to implement those mitigations. And this is starting from the point of view of we're developing a new product from scratch. And so things like input validation, they reckon that that's easy to implement. Everyone should be doing it. And they go through this process and they come up with different numbers for all the different mitigations. So like I said, input validation, they've scored it as a 3 because it's widely understood, it's cheap to implement, and the complexity is very low. And so that falls into the easy bucket. So if you've got a bug that could be fixed by input validation, there's no excuses, you should have done that. And that would be unforgivable. On the other end of the spectrum, language selection. So if you could have removed a bug by changing the language you use, they actually rate that as pretty hard. And
re-implementing an entire application in a mem-safe language, that's a pretty tricky mitigation.
Yeah. So they step through a whole lot of different mitigations, give them all scores, and then they provide this worked example at the end, which is, here's this real-world but anonymized, very serious bug. There was a number of different root causes, but the whole bug could have been eliminated if they'd just done input validation. So, in the report, while the exploitable vulnerability was difficult to find, one of the root causes was deemed easy to implement mitigations for, and two were rated medium. So the overall assessment is this vulnerability should not have existed and is unforgivable.
Yeah.
Now, this is where, for me, the paper falls a bit short. I would have loved to have seen a number of real-world vulnerabilities not anonymized in the report as a kind of an appendix.
You would have liked to have, and I agree with you, they should have gone through the KEV list and said which one of these are forgivable and which one of these aren't. I can imagine there would have been meetings about this, right, at NCSC.
Yeah.
And I think Ollie Whitehouse put this together, didn't he? He's the technical director at NCSC. And
I came across it because of his weekly newsletter.
yeah, right.
And
yeah.
he actually, in the newsletter, he suggests that perhaps, the CVSS system should have a binary field for forgivable, unforgivable.
I mean, I prefer a shame scale, to be honest. It should be sort of like CVSS between 1 and 10 to say how ashamed they should be of these sort of bugs. But, I mean, I can imagine that there would have been meetings about this, and it would have been pretty hard to convince the bosses that, attacking companies worth tens of billions of dollars and saying that their software is junk. I mean, it probably, and again, it wouldn't be them saying it, but their framework saying it. So I think this is a nice compromise where other people can take this criteria, work through the Kev list, and then publish a report on it, according to the NCSC's framework. And it's not really clear from the post. I just looked. It's not really clear if this was, I don't think it was solely Ollie's work, obviously. But yeah, as you say,
I don't think his name's. I'd have to look. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I just had a look. I couldn't see names on it, but it's a good idea. And so here's my question, right? Do you think this lays the groundwork for future guidance and regulation from governments? Because I feel like the metrics that we use to describe vulnerabilities, like CVSS is a great example. I mean, I think there's a little bit of implied shame in a CVSS that's over 9, right? But not always. Sometimes there's just these really weird, subtle bugs that pop up that once people find them, it turns out they're very easy to exploit, and it's just a sort of freak occurrence. But, I don't think policymakers and regulators necessarily, I mean, some will, but a lot won't understand that seriousness is not an indication of forgivability, right? And do you think this will help policymakers to issue guidance, regulation, draft new laws, things like that?
I think it's an attempt to try and provide incentives to do secure development. And so, even though I'm disappointed they didn't name and shame, to me it makes sense that you publish this paper, you get feedback to say, how does the methodology? Do people buy into it?
Yeah.
And if at this point people don't buy into it, then I think you can say, well, we've suggested this. What would be a methodology that would make sense? And then, this feels like a very long process, but it would be, okay, everyone agrees that this makes sense. Let's start implementing it into, those lists, like the KIV list.
Yeah. And then from there, you can look at incorporating that into government procurement, right? Where if you've had, shameful bugs in your software over the last 12 months and not taken steps to address the root causes, well, we're not going to buy your stuff.
Yeah, well, I think that's going on in parallel. So this is like trying to burn, this is a terrible analogy, burn both ends of the candle. So you've got the supply side, you must do these things to end up in, to be bought by government. And this is if you haven't done these things, we're going to, in effect, kind of punish you by having your bugs described in a way that makes you less, your products less saleable.
Yeah.
So I think, there's no one thing that you can do that will fix bugs being in software. So I think this is to me, a complementary approach to all the other procurement side things that you can do, which don't cover the whole market. Because
no, I get it. It's like we're going to slap a mark of shame on, we're going to provide a framework that can put a mark of shame on your products. And I think for a long time, people have expected the market to just sort of rely on vulnerability data to do that, but without some sort of indication as to whether or not, as how shameful it is that they're there in the first place. It's of limited effectiveness. So yeah, very interesting. People can check out more details in the newsletter. Another thing that you've written about, everybody's talking about DeepSeek, which is this Chinese large language model, the Chinese generative AI thing that's come out. You've approached this from a bit of a different angle. I agree with you that people freaking out about the privacy policy, which just strikes us all as just, well, it's upfront, it's honest. Yes, your data's going to go into China and be used because it's a Chinese AI company. It's, the terms of service are broadly in line with what you would expect out of an American AI company. But But I think your point is that Chinese APT crews and disinformation crews and whatever, they now have a homegrown tool that they can use to use AI to do a lot of bad stuff to us, and it's not going to show up in Google's threat reports anymore or OpenAI's threat reports anymore because they've got their own capability. And that's, for you, that's the takeaway here.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons that it's a big deal, but that many of the things that DeepSeek has done actually kind of mitigate the economic and geopolitical implications. The fact that they've released the way that they did it. So you can expect that Western AI companies will basically copy the same recipe. But in terms of providing visibility into what threat actors are doing, I always find the OpenAI and Google reports quite interesting. And they get some insight into how other APT crews are using LLMs. And they can, they get that insight. They can actually try and develop countermeasures, but it also informs the rest of their threat intelligence work. These are the things that people are trying to do. Here are the techniques that might pop up. And they're the sort of companies where the political imperative means that they devote some resources to trying to tamp down on that. Now, DeepSeek, it doesn't seem like they're malicious at all in any way, but they're just a very much smaller company. So I think the figure I heard was 200 people. So you can imagine that there might be in somewhere like Google, maybe, tens of people working on their kind of Gemini threat intelligence type stuff potentially. And that scale of effort just doesn't seem plausible for a company like DeepSeek.
You would remember that yesterday Adam and I spoke about some research that Wiz did where they found like so much of the company's data just lying around basically on the internet. And it's anytime you see a startup go viral like this, you're going to, you take a look and it's a mess, right? So it's going to take them a while. I eventually expect that they will be doing their own threat reports, but being a Chinese company, I'd suggest that possibly they're just being submitted to the MSS and not to the public, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of, it just makes it easier for those crews when they don't have to worry about working their way or jailbreaking, I guess. Companies that definitely view them as adversaries. So it's sort of black and white. If you're working for Google, Chinese APT crews are adversaries and you're working to counter them. I imagine that that's not true for DeepSeek and Chinese APTs. Maybe not. But I think it'll just be easier. They won't worry about turning up in a Google threat report. It's a very capable model that they've released.
Well, and this is the thing, right? It's more capable than the open source stuff that they could access already. But it's not like they didn't have any sort of ability to run a ring-fenced, LLM previously. But I think what's freaked everyone out about DeepSeek is that it's actually quite good.
Yeah. And so, the fact that they were using Gemini means that those crews thought that there was some benefit to those particular types of models that were better than the open source ones. Yeah. So I don't think it's not going to supercharge APT crews. They're not going to suddenly get 10 times better. But I think this is a thing that will happen. There'll be a loss of visibility for Google. So, I think that's a kind of more mundane practical implication.
Yeah. Now, the final thing that we're going to talk about today are some sanctions, some EU sanctions against a Russian APT, which are interesting for two reasons. First of all, the activity dates back a long time. And second of all, it's cyber activity tied to a unit of GRU, which is Unit 29155, which has been linked to stuff like sabotage, assassinations, even this Havana syndrome stuff where the thinking is they were using like directed energy weapons to fry CIA people in their hotel rooms or whatever. Sorry, I didn't mean for that to sound so flippant. But, these are, seriously nasty people. And, I think this is the first we've seen of them being linked to malicious cyber activity, which makes all of this very interesting.
Yeah, so the reason I started to investigate this is I was just trying to make up my mind, is this good news or bad news? Like, it's sanctions of 5-year-old cyber activities targeting Estonia. So that seems like well, what's the point? It's so long ago. If you treat a country misbehaving like a toddler, you want the sort of response to be rapid, clear, and directly tackling what the problem is. And it seems to me that the problem with Unit 29155 is basically the problem with Russia, that they're being extremely aggressive, doing things that are just beyond the pale. So is a slap on the wrist for something that they did 5 years ago, like, does that make sense?
Well, does it make sense not to do it, I think, is the counter-argument. And of course it sort of makes sense to do it, even if it's not going to achieve all that much. I mean, what can you do with a gangster state that does this sort of stuff? Like, your options, your hands are really tied, right?
Yeah. And so I've got this sort of dual opinion now that, yes, it's good news. And it's good news because the EU is flexing its sanction muscles. So the Estonia only formally attributed those actions to that unit late last year, like in September. And so that was tied to some of what the US Department of Justice did. They also outed some of those members and sanctioned more of them, not just, I think it was 3 and so that's good that the EU is getting its ducks in a row, and it's, I guess, greasing the wheels of the bureaucracy to be able to convert an attribution into actual sanctions,
into something real. I mean, you sort of get the impression they could have done this a long time ago, but they just loved they loved their cheap gas before the invasion of Ukraine.
So I spoke to Stefan Sasanto, who's at ETH Zurich, and his view was that when these incidents originally happened, there just wasn't the political will in Estonia to do anything about them, because
don't poke the bear.
Exactly. Like 5 years ago, but that's changed, obviously, and so now.
Well, and I was getting at the point that there's been inactivity from the larger countries in the EU bloc as well, because hey, everybody loves cheap energy, and it's like, I think everybody needs to sit in the corner and do some reflection, Tom.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the problem you're really trying to tackle is that Russia is just. You said it was an outlaw state. It's just doing stuff that people is totally unhappy with. And if you want to tackle that, you have to tackle it with the big tools, not just sanctions. Yeah.
I mean, it was doing that before Ukraine as well. It's been at this for a long time. The things it's been doing to through its intelligence services to State Department officials, for example, well and truly predates the Ukraine war. But, better late to learn than never, right? Tom Uren, that is it for this edition of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll do it all again next week.
Thanks, Patrick.